Okay. Welcome to CS50's seminar, iOS Study Checklist. So my name's Larry Earhart, and what I'm going to try to do in the next 50 or 60 minutes or so is basically go through a checklist of the items that you really need to understand to be able to start and build an iOS app for the iPhone or iPad. This checklist comes from my experience of learning about iOS development a couple years ago, and then building about 5 or 6 apps over the last year, both for the iPhone and the iPad. There's a lot to go through here, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. But if you do have questions about any of the material, first of all, go to cs50.net. The sample code will be available, I guess, later this weekend or maybe Monday at the latest, as well as the slides. And if you're in the class, please feel free to email me directly at larry_earhart@ballastlane.com. There goes the. Okay. So, like I said, iOS has been around for what, 3 or 4 years, 4 years now. If you think about it, if you think about how many hours have been devoted to iOS programming, it's actually staggering when you think about it. If there, if you count the apps in the App Store, think about there 500,000 apps or so, plus or minus. And if you think the average app, took 80 hours, which is probably on the low side, you're looking at tens of millions of hours of iOS development work that's been done. And the good news for us who are learning more about iOS or trying to push our own apps a little further is a lot of that experience is available online in forums like Stack Overflow, on a variety of blogs. So pretty much, if you ever have a question or need to think something through around iOS, just Google it, and I guarantee you'll find a tutorial or some example on the internet that will help you get through what you're going to do. But with that in mind, what I thought would be helpful then, given the vast amount of information that's out there, is to help kind of focus in on what is really important to study and to learn about as you're going from background in C, maybe a little PHP, some JavaScript to develop your first iOS app. And I'm going to do that in three main areas. Sorry. I'm going to show an app that I developed for the Bostonian Society and talk a little bit about some of the unique design considerations you should be thinking about when you build your first iOS app. Then I'm going to talk about the iOS development environment, getting it up and running, Xcode, etc. And then I'm going to go very quickly through a number of key coding concepts that, again, we just don't have enough time to go into detail, but just, take my word for it that this is a pretty comprehensive list of things you need to know about in order to build your first app. And then if we have time, I'll talk a little bit more about where to find more information. Okay, so the app I'm going to talk about here is one that we built for the Bostonian Society here in Boston, not surprisingly, to help augment their tour their tour giving, and also their ability to communicate more about historical Boston, given that, of course, much of it is built over nowadays in the financial district. So the key concepts, I need to move forward here. So the key design considerations that I wanted to highlight here are around these 4 areas: mobility, context, and proximity, device capabilities, navigation and usability, and then the choice you have to make about local versus remote data, given the connectivity issues. So the first point here around, you really want to think about apps that do something that takes advantage of the fact that the device obviously moves around. Okay, we all know that. But also, because that device moves around, it allows you to access that device in the context of doing something, right? So a tour app is a pretty good example of that. You probably know as many or more examples of that compared to me. But think about, what can you do that makes sense in the context where people are standing at that very moment. And that helps you actually do a very important thing, which is slim down the amount of functionality that you're presenting to the user. I mean, as you all know, the screens are quite small. You're limited in the amount of text and buttons and menu items that you can put on there. So really the design is more about removing functionality as opposed to adding it. And understanding context and the fact that the device is with most users 24/7 around proximity allows you to make those choices more effectively. The second thing to think about is device capabilities. Camera, navigation, GPS, the fact that it's connected to the phone, to the internet, et cetera. Just taking a browser-based application and not really leveraging any of those opportunities is your app won't be as good. The third item is really, and we could do a whole day on this, is around navigation and usability. And the key topic there is just think about two things. One is there's never a help screen on most apps, or very few apps have a help screen, so you have to spend more time making sure it's obvious what the user is supposed to do the moment they open up the app. And then think about the usability characteristics. You really have to design, and this is a quote I've heard at a couple design seminars, you really need to think about thumbs and fingers, right? Buttons that are big enough for a thumb to hit, gestures that are easy enough for you to use a single finger, perhaps while you're moving. And then, if you want to bring it to the next level, think about the difference between left-handed users and right-handed users. Think about people holding their phone in one hand versus doing it with two hands. Giving a little bit of thought to that will make your app better. And then finally, thinking very carefully about your choice on whether to have data local, which increases your response time, but kind of locks you into what's on the phone at that moment, given the release cycle. Takes usually a week or two for Apple to get through the release cycle. So whatever's on the app is basically there until your next release. And remote data gives you more flexibility, the ability to update and edit the data, but then you have to start thinking about connectivity and access, and how your app is going to perform without those two things. Any questions or thoughts on that? Is everyone here iPhone users, or pretty much? No? Okay. So you all know this. All right. Okay, let's start with the development environment. Okay. There's a lot here, and there's more than just a development environment. You need, of course, an Intel-based Mac running OS 10.66 or better. I think those are available here at the variety of labs. I see most of you have Macs yourselves, so that shouldn't be a problem. On top of that, then you need the development environment, which is called Xcode. It's a delightful development environment, especially for those of you who are coming from just doing work in gedit or other appliance-based editing tools. You'll feel like you have graduated and gone beyond your wildest dreams, because with integrated breakpoint checking, error handling, all kinds of tools that are designed to make your coding faster, faster and more error-proof. And Xcode also comes with simulators for both the iPhone and the iPad, and they're quite good too. The only things they can't do, they're not very good when you're testing navigation, and they're not very good when you need to test sending email. Pretty much everything else I've found the simulator is good for from a testing environment. Then there's the actual devices themselves, and this is where there's a little bit of complexity that Apple has introduced into the system. I mean, I think it's worth it because it keeps the quality high. But there are a lot of steps that you have to go through in order to get an app from your development environment onto a test device, and even more steps to get your app from from your development environment out into general availability. And again, I'm not going to go into details, but if you're going to work with devices for your project, you need to get familiar with the iOS Developer Portal. The URL is there. If you're going to launch an app to the App Store or do any kind of enterprise distribution, you need to get familiar with iTunes Connect and iTunes itself, as well as, those are the two basic things right now. So iOS Developer Portal and iTunes Connect. And I believe, reading the CS50 website, that all students at Harvard have access to the student version of those, which is good for pretty much anything except for distributing an app to the App Store. In order to do that, you have to sign up yourself as an individual, pay the $99, and then you can launch away with your apps out to the world. So all these elements work in concert to allow you to develop, test, and deploy iOS apps. And the thing that I would recommend is just be patient with the process. There are a lot of steps, right, to go through to get the environment set up, to get it so that you can test on your device. Those steps are well documented, both on the Apple developer site as well as in a variety of blogs. You just have to make sure you step-by-step follow them, just like you do for the problem sets. Don't skip over things that you think don't make sense or you don't need to do now, because you'll inevitably find that was actually the key thing that you're missing, and you'll end up wasting a bunch of time debugging and figuring out why you can't get your own app that you've coded running on your own device. Any questions or comments so far? Okay, so let's take a look at Xcode here first. So Xcode, as I mentioned, is an integrated development environment, and what that means is that it provides you an editing space here for you to work on your code, and then it also provides you a number of output windows where your messages will show up. It gives you a set of tips and hints and helpers, or context-sensitive attributes, is the way I like to think about it. So whatever you're working on in the main code window, there'll be this right-hand list here of helpful either information about what you're working on or attributes that you can set. And you'll see that comes in very handy, especially when we get into Interface Builder, which is where a way you can define the interfaces or the views to your apps in a graphical format. So there's a ton here. Again, like I said, there's not enough time to go into the details, but I'll make a couple key points here. First of all, over here are the files that are involved in your app, and this is I guess a virtual representation of the actual file structure. You can right-click on each one and see where these files actually exist on your hard drive. That's an important thing that you might get hung up on, is making sure that files that you have built or imported to your hard drive end up making it into your actual development environment for you to work on. Has anyone here worked with Eclipse or any other IDEs? So it's similar to that. You just basically have to make sure that you've imported the link to the file into your project so that you can then reference it in your development work. So that's one thing to think about. The other then is just the way of presenting the views that are helpful. You have these helpful icons here. This hides and unhides the attributes window. This hides and unhides your console. And the console has two sets of messages that you have to think about, the local output and then all output. I usually spend most of my time looking at the messages in the all output window. Sometimes that can get hidden if you don't have the right buttons pressed down there. And then you can, of course, hide and unhide the Project Explorer on the right. So that's the basic, really quick, super quick view of Xcode. There are a set of tools that come with it, the Profiler and Analyzer. You will need to use Profiler quite a bit to test for memory leaks. It does exactly what the tool we use to check memory leaks for C did on the appliance. This is just a lot easier to run and a lot more visual feedback around what's going on. And then there's other things like Analyzer, which will find the warnings and errors for you. And then a very important function, the clean function. Every once in a while, Xcode will just kind of lose its mind about your project, and you'll try to launch it on the iPhone or your iPad, and you'll just have no idea why it's not working. Just try clean first. That is a key. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes, but I mean, I know what it does, but who knows what happens to mess up the projects. But I found cleaning, fixes the issues a lot. Okay, and then the last item I'm going to talk about in Xcode is then Interface Builder, which is a really very helpful tool, and it's gotten a lot better in the more recent release of Xcode. It used to be a separate tool. Oh, that didn't work. What's that? How did you get there? It just knows. When I selected, sorry, this is one of the things I had to skip over. So there are classes over here. There's Objective-C classes, .h, header file, .m, implementation, and then there are files called nibs. They're really XIBs, which is XML Interface Builder. And those are the actual files that format the user interface and views that you see when you build them in Interface Builder. You can, of course, build them programmatically and count bits or pixels, which some people prefer. But Interface Builder is a great way to get a good-looking interface up quickly, and there's a lot you can do with it, especially if you're clever. So Interface Builder, like the name suggests, is there for building interfaces. And in Interface Builder, you can define views, and I'll get into a little more detail about this in a second. Views, and then view elements, right? So here I have a view, which is just a 320 by, yeah, that's right, 320 by, I'm forgetting the math right now. Yeah, 320 by 460 pixels screen for the iPhone. It's got view elements in it, like image views, labels, buttons, all different kinds of things that you can put in there. And you can very easily pick those elements from the attribute selector on the right. If I can get the right thing to show up here. Oh, I'm in the wrong. And again, you just have to spend some time exploring. So there's so much detail over here. There's the description type of what we're looking at here. Then this little shield thing here is probably the area where I spent the most. This is where you format the elements here, and then the layout helper, which actually tells you location, height and width, etc. Basically, every single attribute of each element is included somewhere in that menu or attribute inspector on the right. And you just need to take the time to get to know it and check the documentation to find basically everything you need is in there. Just sometimes it's 2 or 3 levels deep down in the navigation structure. So that is Interface Builder and Xcode in 5 minutes. Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. So you can just drag around the buttons in Interface Builder? Yeah. I'll go ahead. Oh, sorry. The question was, can you just move things around by dragging in Interface Builder? And absolutely. And I'll show that in a second. Okay. All right. Okay, that was the development environment. Next, we're going to talk about the coding concepts. Has everybody here done a little work in an objective language, a little bit? Java, Objective-C? Okay. So many of the concepts, so it would be good to, when you're diving into iOS, to spend a little time reading up on that, specifically the relationship between classes and objects, right? So the class is what you code, right? That's the code that I showed you briefly earlier. And then the object is what gets instantiated by your program. So think of, the most helpful metaphor that I've been taught is to think of classes as the cookie cutter, right? And the objects as the cookie, right? So you basically design what shape your class is going to be, how many angles are going to be there, etc. And then when it's time to go make something, you then use that to cut that class or that object out of dough. And that's very important. It's a very important mental leap you have to make sure that you're always instantiating objects and then referring to them properly, and not trying to do something like you would in PHP, where you're just calling other parts of of code. Okay, so classes and objects, variables and methods. Not surprisingly, Objective-C has variables and methods. There are 2 kinds of variables in Objective-C. There are the primitives, integer, Boolean, etc., very similar to what we studied in C. And then there are also object-based variables. And the way to tell when you have an object-based variable in Objective-C is it begins with NS. So for example, a string is NS string, capital N, capital S, TRNG. Hopefully I got that right. And basically what that's telling you, and why that's important to know that that variable is actually another object, is that variable will have methods associated with it. So NSString is a very powerful object in that there are many methods that you can call, like string compare or string contains value. Pretty much anything you need to do to manipulate a string, there is a function in the class NSString that is defined, and you can call once you allocate a new string NSString variable. So think about primitives and think about object-oriented or variables that are objects. Then we also have methods. And there's a lot to read up on there. I'll show you how to call or instantiate methods, call methods between classes, call methods within a class. Again, it's fairly similar to what we did in C. But again, very important to understand scope around methods. Well, that's probably the most important thing to understand, and we'll get into a little bit of that in a moment. The fourth key coding concept that I'm just going to mention is delegation. You really should go read up on delegation because it's a very important concept for iOS development. But basically, the top line definition of delegation is class A and class B will be delegates, right? Or class A will be a delegate of class B. And what that means is that there's a connection between those two classes that allows them to share and leverage each other's code, right? And there are a number of delegates that are basically pre-coded. I'm not sure that's exactly the right term, but that are available to you kind of out of the box with iOS, like UI Alert View. And then there are also ways that you can make your own delegates in your own code by defining them in the classes, and that allows you to have a class work with the methods and methods in the second class in a very coordinated fashion. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but you should really just Google delegation, iOS delegation, and there's tons of good tutorials out there. And then finally, memory management. Memory management is not difficult in Objective-C. It just requires discipline. And what memory management means is that essentially every time you allocate and initialize a variable, meaning reserve some space in memory for that variable or that class or that object, you need to explicitly release it when you're done with it. Now it's very easy to do as long as you're, as I said, disciplined about every time you do an allocate and an init, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Make sure you go do a dealloc somewhere. Call dealloc on that object, on that object. And there are a number of places you can do that, and you will inevitably get yourself in trouble if you're not careful about that and don't carefully think about where you instantiate that object. Is it the method, is that object in the scope of a method? Is it in a class? And then make sure you release the proper scope. Because if you do it incorrectly, you'll get a crash, and there's very little information provided to you by Xcode about what's happening. It just stops, essentially. And after doing that myself about 20 times, the first thing I go do is check all my dealloc statements to make sure I have that right. Okay, so those are some coding concepts to read up on. Let me show a few of them in the example app that I have. Now, instead of wading through the code for my Bostonian Society app, what I have instead is a very simple, actually it's an iPad app that's designed to show these concepts. And I have commented as much as humanly possible in the code. I don't see any of my sectionese here, but I know that it's a pet peeve of mine when people don't comment properly. I've tried to comment as much as I possibly can in here, so that if you just kind of look through this code here, you should be able to follow along with the key concepts that I'm going through in these slides. Everything that I'm talking about here is somewhere in this project, so just go through it when it's available online. But back to the coding concepts. A couple quick things here. How are we doing for time? I can keep going, right? Yeah, 20, 30 minutes? Okay. Let me make sure I have my notes properly. Okay. All right, so as I mentioned earlier going through Xcode, now we're talking about some of the coding concepts. We have Objective-C files. We have header, .h, and implementation.m files that have the header, of course, as we all know, is declaring what this class is all about. So in this case, this is the view class. This is the class that controls that very simple view that I mentioned. And there are a couple things that we have to do here from a methods and variables perspective. The first thing I need to do from a variable perspective is define the UI fields that I'm going to use. So in this case, I have a text field and I have a label. And basically the way you define them is you call the appRoperty function, which is basically does a lot of the basic setup for you, like setting up your setters and your getters, and just removes a ton of coding burden for you that you would otherwise have to do if they didn't have this capability here. And so what I've done here is saying appRoperty, so I'm defining it. I'm setting my getters and setters here. I'm saying this is an IB outlet variable. And that's going to be very important in a second, because what that allows Xcode to do is, okay, I'm going to look through this code and I see something called an IB outlet, or interface builder outlet. And that will allow us to hook up a element that we have defined in Interface Builder to the code that's referred to here. So IB outlet says, okay, Interface Builder, get ready, we're going to do something. UI text field is the actual variable type, and then a pointer, the star, and then the actual variable name. So we're talking about Interface Builder variables. And we have regular variables. These are variables that we'll use to manage some of our logic. And again, it's the exact same thing. Property, non-atomic, retain, read up on what those mean. Variable type, a pointer, and then the variable name. And obviously the variable name can be anything you want. It could be anything. Okay, so that's variables. And then we have methods. I have three kinds of methods that I'm defining here. I have a basic method. So here it's much like C. Well, it is like C. I have a return type, method name. And then I have a method with an argument. Again, return type, method name, argument. And you can have many arguments, as many as you need. I actually don't know if there's a limit. Sure there is. And then the final kind of method that you can have, and again, this is unique to iOS, is you can have an IB action method. And this is, again, a very powerful way of connecting the view that you're going to define to actions that are being done by your code. So just to highlight the difference, so the IB outlet allows you to send text or to manipulate instances or the attributes of the elements that you defined on your in your nib file, and then IB action methods then are called directly on an event in Interface Builder. Does that make sense? Okay. And we're off. Okay, so then let's look at the implementation. The implementation file here. Couple things here. You can just read through it, when you get access to it. But let me highlight a few important things to remember. Don't forget your import statements. So you need to import, of course, the header file for this particular implementation. So that in this case, it's sectionViewController.h. But you also need to import the header files of other objects or classes that you're going to call from this object, right? So in this case, I call the section app delegate, and I'll tell a little bit more about that in a second. And then I also am using some of the data structures in person.h, right, which is a data object definer. So make sure you remember your imports. Okay. Then you name the actual implementation. So this is at implementation section view controller at the top there. Let me move over a little bit. Sorry about that. Okay, so then you synthesize your variables that you define, and basically what that does is basically puts the actual code into the file. You won't see it, but it allows Xcode and the compilers to know what code they have to put in into this actual compiled version of this class for those setters and getters and all the other things that I mentioned earlier to actually work. So that's synthesized. So basically 2 steps to defining variables. You define them in the header file, and then you synthesize them in the implementation file. And then defining methods. You define which methods are in the class in the header file, and then in the actual implementation, not surprisingly, you put the code in there that you want. Now, a couple things here. Here I'm referring to a number of arrays or other variables that I've defined in the header file, like this self.thenewnames NS mutable array alloc init. Let me highlight that. So that is an example of initializing a variable that we've defined in the header file. So if you remember, I had an NS mutable array in the header file called the new names. And here is where I'm actually making it usable. So I'm giving it I'm allocating some memory to it by doing NS mutable array alloc. And then I'm calling the initialize method, which basically sets this variable up. And so that's how you make basically an object accessible in your code. Okay, so if I've done this allocate and initialize, what is the next thing I should do if I were coding this class from scratch to make sure I maintain discipline? Yeah, okay, thank you. I was going to cold call in a second, but okay. So down here in my dealloc method, I explicitly say the new names, which is the local name of that variable, release, right? So that basically will clean. So basically what happens is when we're done with this class, the last thing that happens, or one of the last things that happens in the class, is it calls the dealloc method, which will go through and release those variables that I established, and then it'll call the super dealloc method, which is the dealloc method in NSObject, which is the parent class to this, and then that cleans up everything. Okay. And then you'll go through. You'll notice that there are a number of. I've obviously implemented the other methods that I mentioned. One with a passing an argument. So in this case, int check name, NS string name to check. So I'm passing it a string value, which I can then refer to here. So basically, with this is actually a very helpful statement too. NSLog, very helpful debugging statement. It's basically like your printf that you guys have been working with so far. This will write out the name of that variable, or the contents of that variable to the console down here. Okay. And then one more item that I want to talk about here, and I'm just really going to highlight here, and this is the how to refer to variables in other in the app delegate and other classes. So here, the app delegate is basically, I'll talk a little bit about this more, is a basic file that's in every single, or pretty much every iOS program. And it's the first class that's called when your application is launched. And it does a bunch of setup. It launches the first window, basically taking control of the phone. And then you can also do your own things in there, in the app delegate as well, that you would need done every time the app starts up. So you might want to read some data in there. You might want to check the user defaults. There's a couple things there that are quite handy to put in the app delegate, since you know it's going to be called every single time you launch it. And in this case, I'm just showing you here how you get access to variables in the app delegate. And you do it by doing three things. So the first thing we did is we defined in our interface part of the header file, and you should read up on that, that we're going to have a section app delegate. We're going to allocate it some memory, and we're going to call it app delegate. Again, you could call it anything you wanted. You could call it, Larry's delegate or, J Harvard or whatever. We're basically alerting our class that we're going to be allocating something to a version of section app delegate called app delegate. And what that allows us to do, that makes that instance a class level or an object level. We can access it from any method within our class, right? So we could define this inside of a method, but then we could only access this version of app delegate in that method, or we could define it here so that we can access what we're calling app delegate in any one of the methods that are in the instance of this particular class. And again, just read up on it. It's something important to keep track of where you define these things. So we've done that. That's the first thing we do. And then the second thing we do is that we call some methods in that from that app delegate, where we're basically tying that version to the actual applications, the instance that our app has started, right? So by doing this, now we can gain access to variables and methods that we've defined in the app delegate. And this is the way, you wouldn't use the same exact code for methods or for classes that you define yourself. There's a similar way of doing it. But just make sure you always are defining it in your implementation and then instantiating that version in the code where you need it to be, and then you can start doing stuff with the variables and methods in that class. And in this case, I'm just calling an array that I've set up called starting names, and then I'm putting the values of what's in starting names into. I'm using the array that I've defined in the app delegate called persons. And I'm taking that and putting that into a class level array called self.startingNames. There's a lot to go through there. You should just definitely go back and follow the code and see if you can make sense of it, because that's a key. Using the app delegate, using other classes, and coordinating with those is obviously a key part of iOS development. Okay. Any questions on that? Yeah. Release is, I don't, to be honest, what's the difference between release and dealloc? I'm not going to be able to describe that properly. You basically, you release variables is what, I'm sorry. Release is an actual function, right? So release is what releases the memory from code. Dealloc is a method in a class, right? So the parent class of all these classes that we are looking at, called NSObject, has a method in it called dealloc, which does stuff, right? So when you say dealloc, you're basically calls the local version of dealloc, which has those releases in it. And then the last thing, if you remember, it called super dealloc. And then it calls the NSObject version of dealloc and does a bunch of other memory cleanup. To be honest, I don't know what it does in there, but that's the difference. So release is the actual function of releasing, and dealloc is a method. Does that make sense? Thanks for the question. Okay. All right, let's talk very quickly about the view concepts. View concepts, this is just a wonderful part of working in iOS, is that you can really build very nice-looking views very quickly using Interface Builder. And there are a couple concepts that you need to make sure you understand. The first is that when you're building a view, there's several different kinds of views out there. There's UI view, which is just a plain window. There's UI table view, which is a table view, not surprisingly. Then there's UI web view, which is a native version of basically a Safari browser, so you can do You can call the internet from there. You can do HTML, all kinds of stuff. And then there are a number of other user interface types that basically support you doing different kinds of things within your app. So these are the three most prominent ones, UI View, UI Table View, and UI Web View. Definitely read up on those to learn more. All those views are defined in a zip file or nib file, which I talked about earlier, if you do it in Interface Builder. You don't need the nib file. You can define everything you want programmatically in your code. But just pretty much all applications, or most applications, will have nibs for at least part of a certain number of views. And as I mentioned earlier, views have view elements. And those view elements have events, like button presses. And those views have outlets, which is basically the ability to then hook up that element back to code that we had defined in our classes. OK, let's take a quick look at those. OK, so we're going to go into Interface Builder here just by clicking on a nib file. OK. Let me get rid of some of this other stuff. And what this is a hierarchical set of items. So you have the view. A view is just think of a view as a card, right? That gets presented in front of, gets presented to the user. And you can, in this case, this app is very simple, so we only have a single view, right? But most apps will have multiple views that you kind of stack up on top of each other and then dismiss or bring to the front or manipulate as your code requires. So in this case, also thinking about hierarchy here, this view then has a number of sub-elements, like a label, a button, not surprisingly, and a text field. You can read up on those. All of those come from the list of items down here on your inspector, basically. And basically any view element that you want to put on there, you just simply select it and drag it, and there you go. There you have a segment switch, right? Now, it won't do anything. Like if I were to launch the app right now with this new element on here, there we go. It will behave properly to touches, turn on and off, but it's not doing anything. It's not connected to any code that's going to be helpful to us. So this is where the IB outlet and the IB action concept that I mentioned earlier comes into play. So basically, what you'll do is that if you right-click on these elements, it'll present this connection model here. Can you guys see that all right? Is that? OK, this is the connection model for the file's owner. And I've defined the file's owner over here in our attributes area, where it is here. So this nibs owner is section view controller, right? So I defined it here, there. And so basically that's saying, OK, this nib is related to this set of code. And if you remember, in that code that we went over, we defined two IB outlets, my field and my label. And we defined one IB action, right? And so that's what comes up here on this list. So you have outlets and actions. And then you have a number of other things that are just connected just out of the box. So view is connected to view. That just comes standard when you have a new file. Again, here, a tip. If you find something that is behaving oddly when you launch it and you get weird errors, it's quite often the connection model, you messed it up somehow when you were doing your coding, or you have the wrong the wrong file name up in the class, or there's another place where you've defined a nib along here. And many times, in the 2 times I've TF'd the mobile application class, that has been a big stumbling block for a lot of people when they first start building iOS apps is understanding the relationship between the class and the nib and the connection model. And so how do you make connections? Well, it's very easy. You can either do it from here, or you can actually right-click on the object itself. I'll get it one of these days. And say if I were to release that, all you need to do is, in this case, to connect a button to an IB action, you just pick up the touch up inside, and then you drag it up to the file's owner, which is kind of there. And then if you can see that, it will present you with a list of potential methods that you can connect to. In this case, we only have one IB action method, button pressed. I click on that, and voila. Now when I click on this button, I call the method in the owning class called button pressed, right? Does that make sense? It's pretty straight. It's amazingly powerful, I think. And how quickly you can build up views using that connection model. I've done the same thing for the field. I could also connect labels. In this case, I'll show you what a referring object is. In this case, a message. This is a UI text, UI label. And in this case, nothing happened. There's no action, right, for a label, but there is a referencing outlet. And so in this case, remember I define it as my label as an IB outlet in the code. And what this allows me to do is to update the attributes of that label, the text, the font, you name it, the location, anything that you'd want to do, you can now do programmatically by connecting the code IB outlet to this particular element. Okay? Any questions on that? All right. Last item to go through is data. And I'm just going to do it very quickly. My experience has been mostly I like to use XML or some kind of human-readable data as input data, whether it comes native in the app bundle or whether you're downloading it. Just found it's a lot easier for my clients to edit that data themselves. So we have a way, not surprisingly, of importing XML data, and I've provided an example class called XML Parser. Here I won't go through the details, but it comes from actually, wow, it's quite old, almost 4 years ago. 3 years ago, excuse me, example from iPhone SDKarticles.com. And basically what this does is reads through an XML file looking for elements, persons, and person, and then reacting accordingly to that. I have a very simple XML file, first name, last name, and then putting them into an array in the app delegate that then I'll be able to refer to later. So just take a look at that. It's pretty straightforward. Just follow the example. And then you use core data, which I actually don't have examples here. I ran out of steam last night, so I apologize. Did not get to implement that. But core data is good for then saving user-generated data like favorites or scores or any kind of information that your app you're going to want to share from session to session. Again, it's very, very powerful. It's very easy to set up. There are just a number of methods you need to cut and paste into your classes, and then design the data model, and then you're off to the races. So XML and core data. Okay. And then the last part of our tour is just all the different pieces that come when you start a new project. And sorry, I got to switch back here. And they're there, and it's important that you understand what they do. You have a main.m class, which is what basically kicks off the whole process. Very simple. You never touch it. You have the app delegate, which is the first method, or it's the first class that gets called when your app launches. You have the main window, which is basically the main window that kind of takes over the phone and then allows you to manipulate the items in it. You have a set of a plist set of variables called info.plist, where you establish all kinds of behaviors, icon, shine, name, version, etc. There's many entries in there. And then you have frameworks. There are a number that come out of the box, and then there are a number that you have to add. Say if you want to handle audio or video, there are frameworks to handle that. And let me just show you what it looks like to start a new project, and then we will go to questions and then end not too much after our time. Okay, so if you go ahead and you start a new project here, you have a variety of templates that you can use. You can read about them, but say if you wanted a tabbed application, that you know what tabs are going across the bottom, you select Start, you give it a name, and I already have one. And then right out of the box, you get all those elements that I mentioned. You get your app delegate, which I mentioned. You get your some basic views. Again, they're all empty. You get the supporting files. You get your plist strings. You get your variables, and you get main. So right out of the box, this will run, and basically all it's doing is saying, giving me an error message. Well, anyways, what happened to that? I'll learn how to operate this one of these days. So you just run it. And then what this is doing all the setup to basically make the iPhone screen and the processing capabilities available to you. So you can play around with that. There are all kinds of views. There are tab views. There's utility view. There's table views. And it'd probably be a good place to start is to open up an example project like this and just start to explore the connections between those different elements and start adding a few values and see what happens. Okay. So that is iOS in 50 minutes. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there's a very active, not surprisingly, developer community on Stack Overflow. I mean, basically anything that you need to do, just type it into Google, and there'll be a Stack Overflow case for it. If you want to dive into a more structured introduction to iOS, I would check out the most recent version of the mobile application development class that David Malin gave at the Extension School, CS76.net. On there are, in the second half of that class, are lectures, examples, seminars similar to this, etc. That would be quite a good resource. And then just literally thousands of other sources, which you could probably find on your own better than I could tell you where they are. The lectures for the Extension Mobile Application Development class are at CS76.tv 2011 spring. And they're quite good, quite helpful if you have the time to go through that. So again, thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for going a little over. And again, I'm available for questions. Thank you.